Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Cipriani College's commemoration of Labor Week 2020 webinar series. This is the fourth webinar. It is entitled Deconstructing the Legal Framework for Worker Protection as part of our series on the state of the trade union movement in a period of flux. My name is Ian Daniel. I am the head of department, the Labor Studies Department in Cipriani College. And I would like now to introduce you to our panel. At the top with the National Workers Union sign behind him is Mr. Dave Smith. Dave is the president of National Workers Union and one of the principal lecturers in the Labor Studies Department at Cipriani. Dave also lectured at Arthur Lockjack and other institutions. The next gentleman at the top of the screen is the esteemed Mr. Alva Allen. Mr. Alva Allen is a stalwart in lecturing at the Cipriani College Labor Studies Department. He lectures almost everything there is that comes out of a trade union. Dave was formerly, not too long ago, the education officer, the education officer at Big Woo. And the lone lady on the panel is Mrs. Janice Johnson-Lorde, one of the people that I am most proud of. Ms. Johnson-Lorde is also a lecturer at the college. Ms. Johnson is in charge of change management and introduction in the Labor Studies Department. She is also one of my very first students at Cipriani College and has gone on to become a distinguished student in several institutions, including Arthur Lockjack. So our panelists will be discussing our title, our webinar, the Deconstructing the Legal Framework for Worker Protection in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown that we have just experienced and the effects of which we continue to experience. So we will start with a presentation from Mr. Dave Smith. We will follow that up with a presentation from Ms. Janice Johnson-Lorde, and Mr. Alva Allen will tie everything up at the end. So without further ado, let me introduce Mr. Dave Smith. Dave, take it away.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, I think one of the things that we've got to do is to look at this from a very broad perspective. So what I am going to try and do is to wind things up a little bit. Now, for years, employers have been playing with euphemisms for things that we normally understand. They don't make people redundant anymore. They let you go. Now, the only things that are happy when you let them go is a parrot, because you open the cage door and they're free. Employers don't have workers anymore. They have associates who are part of the family. A lot of employers don't give warning letters anymore. They give advisories. And the latest linguistic distortion is something called new normal. Now, if you want to translate that into reality and what that actually means, it means the employers have moved the goalposts and you've got to accept these as new arrangements as being normal. Well, that really is part of what the challenge is about, because what we've seen over the last couple of months are workers being on the receiving end of cuts in pay, sometimes not just for a short period, but permanent changes to contracts. We've seen cuts in hours. Sometimes we've seen cuts in pay and hours at the same time. Arbitrary dismissals. Mr. COVID-19 has the authority to dismiss you, it seems. Long-term layoffs with no pay and redundancies, as well as obviously the employers taking advantage of what they've learned during the last 8 weeks or so and going into major restructuring. So before we get confused about these claims that we're all in it together, let's take a little step back and see what is new about all of this and put it into some sort of proper perspective so that we We just don't get too confused about this. Now, the employment relationship is fundamentally unequal. It always has been. It's the employers who decide who and when to employ, how and when to dismiss, when to reorganize and make workers redundant. So the balance of power in the employment relationship is tilted firmly in the employer's favor. Now, the traditional workers' response to this has been to organize. Right? It's you're a lot stronger if instead of going to see the boss and say, I don't want this and I would like that, if you go to the boss and say, we don't want this and we want that, then implicit in the we is the potential threat that we will do something about it if we don't get what we want. And so that old slogan, together we bargain, divided we beg, has a lot of truth to it. Now, that first line of defense that workers have, which is organizing, in Trinidad and Tobago is in a pretty sorry state. About 15 to 20% of workers out of the global workforce that we have are covered by union collective agreements. And really what that means is that the balance of these non-organized workers have to rely for their protection on what might be provided by either the law or maybe case law that's been developed in the industrial court. Now, of course, both of those things will have been influenced by trade union activities and trade union involvement. But let us have no illusions about the law. Laws are not neutral. They are passed in response to social pressures and the balance of class forces that are prevalent at the time. Now, whether it's in response to changing social attitudes, for instance, to matters like abortion or gay rights, where maybe society's views are ahead of legislation, particularly colonial legislation that we have. And in some societies, there's been very fundamental changes in law in response to these changes to social attitudes on these sort of issues. But the other thing is in response to the sort of pressure that we see being currently put on the capitalist class in America by the Black Lives Matters movement, which has now extended its demands and its issues well beyond the issue of the murder of George Floyd. And so it takes pressures like that to generate real changes in society. And if you look at the Industrial Relations Act, for instance, it has in some ways got some benefits for unions, but its primary objective always was to restrain and constrain workers' ability to take industrial action in defense of their interests. And this was a typical product of class forces that prevailed at that particular time. And of course, this is true of any labor legislation. It depends on who's the strongest, who wants what, and of course the employers have their own view. And we've seen the ECA's contribution to amendments that they would like to see to the Industrial Relations Act, which would pretty well decimate it if they got half a chance. So what we need to do then is remind ourselves that COVID-19 does not change the law. And what's happening in reality is that the employers have rearranged the employment relationship in their heads. And they're carrying on as if contracts of employment and the law no longer apply. What they're trying to do is to create a new normal by tearing up contracts and ignoring the law. The truth of the matter is that they will get away with it if there is no resistance. And we have to take the position, in my view, that there is no such thing as a new normal. Our starting point has to be that the old normal continues until there are discussions and negotiations about any changes that have to take place. And workers need to learn the lessons, very hard lessons, that they need to get organized. Unity is strength is not just a slogan from history. It describes the reality of the employment relationship today and every day. So, Ian, that is my attempt to provoke people this evening.
Thank you very much, Dave. That was kind of short and straight to the point. I like the point that you made about the new normal existing in the heads of employers, and that the law has not changed. Let me ask you this though: the one cannot deny the impact of COVID-19, the pandemic around the world, its impact on the economies as we literally had to shut ourselves indoors to prevent the spread of the virus. So was there any real alternative to the actions that we have seen taken um, in response to the economic effects of the pandemic?
Well, a 20% cut when you're on low wages and a 20% cut when you're part of the 1% is very different. And the reality is these 1%ers and the big businesses in particular, I'm talking about, Ansel McCall, Neil and Massey, the real big conglomerates, they can afford to absorb paying full wages over the period that we had the lockdown. Now, it's true some of the smaller little businesses are going to struggle, right? But the economy, we live in a capitalist economy, and there's always ebbs and flows in the economy. And so we've always been used to a drop in the building industry or a boom in here or a slump in there. And we've always negotiated and dealt with that. And until we get a socialist planned economy where we have a commitment to guarantee that workers have work, workers have jobs, then trade unions have always had to fight these things. And sometimes we win and sometimes we lose. But the starting point for me isn't that we've all got to tighten our belt and take some cuts. The starting point has got to be, why should we have to do that, right? What is the normal situation? And okay, if we have to negotiate going backwards, then that's what we have to do. But it depends where the starting point is. The starting point for me is not new normal, it's old normal. That's where we start from, for me.
Okay, all right. Another interesting point that you made just before we go on to Ms. Lorde was the ethos of the origins of the laws, the legislation that we have presently. You talked about the existing legislation coming out of that period of the 60s and 70s, where the main intent seemed to be to restrain what was considered the negative actions, the negative impact of industrial action by trade unions. So, like, was the existing law sufficient to deal with the COVID-19 situation to protect workers during the COVID-19 lockdown, in your opinion?
Well, was it ever designed to protect workers? I mean, that has to be the starting point, really. I mean, because when you look at the Retrenchment and Severance Benefits Act, I mean, it doesn't actually pay people very much even for many years of service, and it's based on your earnings. So if you're low paid, you don't get much out of it. Now, a better solution that unions have been arguing for is that there should be a national redundancy fund or a national unemployment fund that's actually paid for by the employers on a regular basis. Now, that would begin to tackle things in a more fundamental way. The Industrial Relations Act it wasn't seen to be designed to stop industrial action. That was its primary purpose, right? The unions were too strong that they couldn't just take that away without giving something back. And so there are bits and pieces in the Industrial Relations Act that provide avenues for workers and unions to do things. Right? But let us not get away from the fact, if you go back to the arguments that Eric Williams was putting forward, the main argument quite simply was capitalists will not come to Trinidad and Tobago to spend their money because they can't make profit, because you damn unions are getting organized, demanding recognition, and you want wage increases. Well, that was the core of the debate at the time. And so we have to see what the rationale is behind the Industrial Relations Act. And it doesn't matter what legislation that you look at, really, it's going to be, legislation is a compromise, right, between the interests of the workers and the labor movement on the one hand, and the interest and the influence that the employers have through the ECA and the Chambers of Commerce and the 1%ers buying their way into the PNM and UNC, because whoever pays the piper calls the tune. All right, so there's plenty of ways that the one percenters and the ruling class, the capitalist class, can influence the outcome of legislation. So we have to live with what we have. But the point of my contribution is to say, listen, let's go back and understand the nature of the society we're in. Right? We're in a capitalist society. We're in a class-based society. As unions, we represent class interests, the interests of the working class, and we must not be naive in thinking that there are laws out there which are designed to help us. If they do, then fair enough, we have to fight on all fronts. Right? If we have the strength, if we have the industrial strength to take on the employers, then that's going to be a lot quicker and a lot more effective. If we don't have the industrial strength to do that, we've got to fall back on the bureaucracy of the Ministry of Labour and the Industrial Court and whatever we can extract from the legislation. But if you want to go to the Industrial Court, you'll get a date, probably late 2021, maybe 2022. So don't hold your breath, all right? That's not a quick solution.
Ian, may I come in at this point?
Yes, Alva, go ahead.
Thank you very much. On the question of the sufficiency of the existing labor laws, I just wanted to raise just one or two quick points on what Dave was attempting to say. With the COVID-19 impact on the workers, I am certain that quite a number of business places went under. They're not opening back, for sure. And workers would have lost their jobs completely. But they don't have any severance pay to get because the Retrenchment and Severance Benefits Act makes no provision for that. And that has been so from since the day that the act was passed. The test case for that was commercial finance. Look at what happened with ArcelorMittal workers in 2015 when the steel plant was closed down and all the workers, 600 workers were sent home, penniless, not 1 cent in severance pay to get. And you know what happened? It reminds me that year in, year out, government come, government go. The trade unions have been calling on each and every respective government to amend the legislation. It is not now, you know. When this government came in, of course, we put in proposals to amend it to take care of that loophole. And nothing, absolutely nothing, has been done about it for the last, 35 years. That loophole still exists today. And as a result of that, workers continue to suffer. So while there is law and can protect some, the fact of the matter is that it is not sufficient. It is completely insufficient to address the realities that workers are going through. And all our cries have fallen on deaf ears. It appears to me that very soon, we in Trinidad and Tobago will have to do like what the rest of the world doing. The left foot goes in front, followed by the right foot. That is how they march. So that's just a small contribution I wanted to make.
Okay, thank you very much, Alva. Ms. Lorde, you have anything to say before you go into your substantive presentation? Mike, your mic.
I'm sorry. I think Alva would have preempted my response to the question.
But that's all right, you'll take your response anyway.
My question is, it is not sufficient, so resounding no. And might I add, even what is insufficient is ignored at the whims and fancies of the employer. Sadly, this includes government, who is the largest employer and has a dual role in terms of management of the economy. This second role seems to overpower and subordinate its role as an employer. The question is asked regarding effectiveness of this legislation, but effectiveness has to do with the rationale and objective for enactment in the first instance, and Dave would have hinted on that. Law or legal frameworks set boundaries of acceptable behavior, and they prescribe sanctions for breaches. Laws play a role in a variety of order. So we're seeing breaches, but we're not seeing sanctions, as I think Dave or Alva hinted. Not until 2021 or probably 2022. And by that time, a long list of woes will be faced by the worker. So we're looking at why we have laws: public order, political order, social order, economic order, moral order. These are some of the principles espoused by Martin Partington. But we are seeing, in fact, that the law, as Dave would have said, is really designed to protect whom? It's constrained in terms of the extent to which it can shape the various orders. And we know it is shaped by political and other forces. So we know the law will play different roles in different situations and in different societies. All right? We know, for the most part, for those of us who would have studied sociology, law literally protects the haves as opposed to the haves not. It is not neutral and it cannot organize society. Law is formed based on pressures put upon the system by those of us who are affected by it. So the strength of the law is really contingent on our strength to organize. All right? And we've seen it, the breaches. The Industrial Relations Act, though limited in some aspect, there's some fundamental aspect that we think still works for the trade union. For instance, Section 40, and that compulsory recognition to treat. What did we see happening during COVID? It was seem as though we had no trade union at all, unilateral decision-making, a totally unitary perspective. The things, the Servants Benefit Act, yes, we know we have some limitations, but we're saying even where it is limited, that which exists is also being flouted. The procedure for terminating, consulting, reporting, notice period, searching for alternatives, the aspect of severance pay. So you'll find the law is there, but it's not being enforced. Why is another issue that we need to dig deep to find out why it is not being followed. All right? The first recourse is to terminate the worker on whose backs the economy is being built. All right? Let's look at even at the Health and Safety Act and how that will come into play now in terms of this COVID. They had an amendment to the act where the worker had the right to refuse to work when his life or other was affected. They amended that and removed the deleted or other. And now we are seeing how relevant or other has become post-COVID. My concern is while we speak about the new normal, the normal may persist in terms of the extent of the legal protection afforded to workers in Trinidad and Tobago. Because it's normal to not contemplate what is in the best interest of working people who are expected to work towards building economies. More importantly, for me, the lack of adherence or non-compliance to what already exists. Because we will craft new laws, we'll amend new laws, and if it is not enforced, we will have the same results. So I am saying, let me say here, this is not unique to any one party in power, and I think Dave mentioned it. It's about governance structures and systems. Who sets the agenda for the politicians and by extension, the society? I have yet to see any government make decisions in the interest of labor. And we've had labor, and this is sad, labor ascended into political realm, and yet there is no change, positive change that is, for labor. The infractions of that I think COVID was used, because prior to COVID, we had the issue of Petrotrin, we had the issue of TSTT, and I want to believe, had it not been for COVID, it would have gone on to another entity, WASA or some other entity. The strangest thing is that we mentioned the big conglomerates and foreign direct investments and so on. And Arthur Lewis would have prescribed industrialization through invitation because one of his premises that we are risk averse. But what we see now, these same big conglomerates seem to be risk averse because they could not absorb the shock for 6 weeks and chose to sacrifice the daily bread of the workers when they could afford to do that, because that's a function of the retained earnings. So we have to look closely at what we can do and how we can respond to bring about the change before we could say new. To my mind, we are very much in the old, and if we're not careful, we could find ourselves back at our watershed period where labor really have to labor for what they want. Consultation is key, and it seems to be bandied about. When I looked at that national tripartite committee for consultation and what it is saying it was about and its intent, and yet in a time and a crisis like COVID, government chose not to consult, but to be arbitrary in their approach to decision making. I looked at the terms of reference for the National Tripartite Advisory Committee, where they prescribe, okay, we understand creation of additional jobs in the current circumstance, understandably, is a global fallout, and they would not be able to create additional jobs under the circumstance. But wanton retrenchment with impunity cannot be condoned. The RSBA speak about seeking alternative solutions. Have the employers sought alternative solutions? The terms of reference for the same committee speak about focusing the attention on the needs of the poor, displaced, and the vulnerable. Yet the responses by the employers exacerbate the situation by displacing workers even more so, right? The maintenance of industrial peace. How could we maintain industrial peace when you are perpetrating this type of injustice on the working class? You continue to want your big profits, create poverty, and we know the socioeconomic fallouts in terms of crime. You pay for it in another way. And therefore, we now as labor must be minded that if we sit idly by and allow change to come and we not help to bring that change, we'll have a heavy price to pay. The trade union has several functions that they too must revisit and see how do we empower membership. The executive of the trade unions cannot do it alone. We need all the actors to be on board. We need public support. We need membership growth. I see this as an opportunity for workers to understand that their interest is best represented if and when they are organized. And therefore, when we organize, we can now speak to business, and Black Lives Matter and the economies out there feeling it because we understand you need our money. And when we organize and we speak to employers and let them know that you cannot treat workers the way you're treating workers, I think then we can speak to the issue of a new normal.
Thank you, Ms. Lorde. Let me ask you this. You're talking about, we have been talking about the basis of law, the way law operates. We've been saying that the law has not worked in favor of the worker, but what is the responsibility of the worker? I mean, if we consider the laws to be, well, for lack of a better word, biased to begin with, then and we enter into a situation like this. Dave has pointed out that it's only about 20% maximum of the working population that is covered by collective bargaining, collective bargaining agreement. So what is the responsibility of the worker? Can the worker sit down and expect the employer or the government to act in their benefit?
The worker must organize, and the worker must know it's important for them to organize. Join a union of your choice. It is your right to so do.
Yeah, and
because we can't do it for you.
Yeah, we can. But don't the unions also have a responsibility to attempt to mobilize workers?
Certainly.
Yeah.
Certainly, because they must build capacity, sensitization programs, awareness, and more importantly, training. And I think that's where Cipriani comes in terms of training as well. We have a lot of people, even members of the trade union, who have not seen it fit to build their capacity to represent properly. And we have to take part of the responsibility too for the failings. Yeah? As well as we need more collaboration between and among the unions. Speak from one voice, not necessarily one platform. We have to organize as an institution. We have to collaborate our efforts. All right? Because the ECA coming together, employers are coming together, and the unions, and I think they said it, right? Together we bargain, divided we beg. Okay, so unions now have to find a way to come together, particularly now, because what affects one is going to affect all. And we need to be able to lobby government to say we would not be accepted.
I think we definitely have to address the issue of union and labor responsibility in relation to the existing laws and the failures of the application of those laws to protect workers in the period. Gentlemen, you have anything to add before we go to Alva? Mike?
I think one of the sad things is that many workers believe that if they join, they don't have the right to belong to a union. If they join, the employer will dismiss them. Now, the fact is, I think many employers think they could dismiss you for belonging to a union as well. Now, whilst the law is very clear that you have a legal right to belong to a trade union, and it's illegal for the employer to victimize you or take action against you, you don't get dismissed for joining a union. You get dismissed for being late for work, or all of a sudden there's redundancies and it happens to be those that are organizing the workforce. We know the reality. The reality and the law sometimes can be fundamentally different.
Alva?
Yes, I think that we need to put some cards on the table and be a little frank and honest in our discussions. Many unions do not have an organizing department. That is a fact. And this is the opportunity now, again, for the unions to devote specific resources
Collaborating
towards organizing the unorganized 480,000 workers that don't belong to trade unions. The workforce is 600,000 or a little over that. And we have a little less than 20%, which is about 120,000. So it's 480 plus thousand workers not in a trade union. That is completely unacceptable. We have to, as trade unions, we have trade union federations sit down and work out a campaign to organize workers into unions. So that's just one of the first things that we need to do. Now, organizing workers into unions also requires that the unions have people who are trained in organizing. Organizing workers to join a union is a particular skill. You have to know how to be able to approach people, what to tell them, and so on. How to get them to be interested in unions. You just can't up and tell, hey, come on, join it. It don't work like that. Not in today's world. And maybe this is an opportunity for Cipriani to consider doing a program on organizing skills to train officers, union officers, how to go about the task of organizing workers into new bargaining units.
Well, Alva Boy, as Ms. Lorde pointed out, like I guess we all have responsibility to take for the situation that we see developing today. Because I know for myself, I've been discussing the issue of organizing as a course with other lecturers for about 2 or 3 years now, and we just haven't gotten it off the board. So yeah, we have to take up that challenge, and we have to do it within the next academic year. I agree with you.
But just an interesting point that I saw in the UK Guardian is that trade union membership in Britain is actually increasing. As a result of this, membership has increased. Workers have recognized the need for protection. So this is an opportune time to get out there and get organized.
Yeah.
But if I may, and Alva, thanks for the invitation to put the cards on the table. There was a time when the union membership was strong, and then persons started to give up on the union and drop out and resign from the union. And therefore, becoming a part of a union is one thing, but the services as promised, delivery is also important. Follow through is also important. And the issue of, because we deal with human beings, right? Self-interest, people become disillusioned in terms of their expectation. So it's so much more has to go into organizing, right? Selecting of leadership. I mean, we know it's power and politics at a different level, nonetheless. However, the workers' interests must be the driving force and the driving factor in what we do and why we do it. Because very often we have positions being represented on the table, and when you talk to membership, that's not their position. So we too have to look internally as to how we do things and how we can bring about that change that will attract membership, build our credibility in the environment. So the issue I'm talking about, trust. Can they trust us to represent their interests and not our own agenda? Thanks, Alva, for encouraging us to put the cards on the table.
Well, yeah, like that, you know.
What do you say?
Okay, Dave, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that I think it's important to have some understanding of the drop in trade union membership, because whilst Janice said, you know, people resigning from unions, there's no real evidence that I've seen that people have been resigning en masse from trade unions. I mean, the fact is, if you think about it, the areas of the economy where unions are strong those are the ones that are being decimated. And really the challenge is to break into new areas. So if you think about it, we used to have a car plant here, which was organized. We used to have an oil industry that was organized. We used to have a sugar industry. When we had one, it was organized. Right? We used to have a steel industry. Now, we're not talking about little handfuls of people here. We're talking about thousands of members. And when they shut down Caroni and 9,000 workers lost their jobs, the ripple-on effect into the rest of the economy was very significant. I saw as many as 20,000 other people were impacted by that. So let us not just say, well, people are resigning, because you're seeing this change in pattern in Britain, for instance, which I'm more familiar with. The strong areas of mining, shipbuilding, engineering, those are the areas which were solid union bastions. And of course, when those get eroded and destroyed through globalization or privatization or whatever, then of course, you know, the membership base erodes. There's not people leaving unions, right? It's unions finding their membership just no longer there in the areas that they organize. Now, of course, that is a challenge, right? But there's no doubts about it. If you look through the history of the trade union movement generally, unions have always had to adapt to changes in the economy, changes in the economic infrastructure within which they operate, right? And one of the things that you see is one of the biggest growing unions in Trinidad and Tobago is the banking insurance union. Now, that is a union that, I mean, if you go back 30 years and you thought of bank workers and insurance people and white-collar workers being unionized, I mean, you would have had a job thinking about that. But look at that. I mean, Bigwell have broken into that. Now, that's not unique in Trinidad and Tobago, right? It's practically every financial institution in Britain, for instance, is unionized at one degree or another. You go back to the 1930s, there was a little union called the National Union of Bank Employees that even survived. So, you know, those people who say that unions are an anachronism and a product of history, and that's where they belong. The fact is, unions are a product of the society within which they function and operate. But that doesn't mean that they can go to sleep or just expect workers to come to them. You've got to get out go and get organized. But I mean, if you look at some of the interesting events that have taken place in America, for instance, where there are campaigns over a $15 an hour minimum wage and things like that. I mean, those have been street organizations. Our unions have been in there backing them, but there's a lot of interesting and novel ways in which workers are being mobilized.
Yes.
And when you look in our economy here, I mean, one of the growth areas in the economy is the security industry.
Yeah.
Any real organization in there. If you, I have to say, in our union, we have workers coming here who've been dismissed. And they come in again because they found a job in another security company, and they've been dismissed from there, right? And I mean, there are people who work in that industry. There's about 90,000, I understand, in that industry. The wages are appalling. The employer's behavior is appalling. The working conditions are appalling. They have them on a 12-hour shift, sometimes 24 hours if there's no relief, and they won't pay them overtime. And if you don't smile, they fine you. Or if your boots aren't shiny enough, they take $200 out of your wages. And that's a nightmare industry. Now, if we can't organize that, then we couldn't organize a booze up in a brewery. We need really to get our act together in some areas.
But Dave, I mean, that's the question. When we were organizing the Labor Week celebration, I offered Atkins Vidal the title, The Age of Extinction. Have we missed the falling meteor? That where we continuing to concentrate in the areas that are falling out of the economy. Do we have the time, to make the switch into the new areas? Do we have the ability to be flexible enough for the new types of organizations, the new types of work that are emerging, the new types of social movements that are emerging and organizing working
for revolution?
Well, you see, one of the challenges, if you look at the Occupy Wall Street that there was some years ago, and even if you look at the Black Lives Matter developments in America, unless that generates an organization that is capable of leading things into the future, when all the hype and the enthusiasm and the buzz has settled down, and the movements on the street have eased up a bit, you've got to have the ability to stick in there a long time, and that requires organization. And that is one of the things that emerged out of 1937, for instance. That did not appear to emerge out of the general strike and events in 1919 in Trinidad, where there was a big movement, and as far as I'm aware, nothing permanent came out of that, even though there was important progress made. Now, the fact that 1937 generated a permanent trade union movement was one of the lessons that workers, I think, learned and historically have learned.
Alva?
Yes. This question of organizing, it raises some nice points, and Janice was complimenting it with the question of the quality of representation as well, that is provided at all levels to workers. First of all, there needs to be a broader discussion on the topic, because the amount of issues that have to be dealt with, we can't deal with it here. Right? For example, we have to come up against the whole process of recognition that has worked against us. Right? And it's a long time now we have marched for reform of labor laws to get rid of that process and replace it by a much simpler process so that people can be in unions. That's one of the first hurdles that we have to cross as well. And in looking at what Janice had said about the quality of representation, right, and the quality of the service that we provide, I think that being a lecturer at the college, it has opened up my eyes and ears to all different types of comments that I never expected or dreamed that I would hear about the organizations I've given my entire 48 years to. when it comes to quality of representation. And clearly, the training that must be provided so that the task of proper representation can be given. We have to encourage unions to get involved in training their shop stewards, their branch officers, their labor relation officers, so that they can meet up to the challenges that are in front of us. Because
Yeah.
I hear the complaints, and of course I can't say much. As a lecturer, I have to listen. One of the students who I'm supervising, her research paper is dealing with the same question: can unions meet up to the task of being a champion of social justice? And her view is no, they can't represent nobody. They don't represent. I mean, it's not her alone, right? No, no, it really doesn't say that the task is insurmountable. We can correct those things, but there needs to be some concerted effort to push forward with it and not just talk about the problems and complain, but to get down into the business of settling those issues.
Agreed. But can I invite you now to go into your substantive presentation?
Well, Ian, I think that we have reached the proverbial point where everybody has said what I wanted to say.
Then just repeat it. Then bring it back on the table first.
Well, listen, can I just before Alva does that, Alva made a very important point on the recognition process, and that opens up a number of other things that are beginning to develop. Right now, National Workers Union has just got a new bargaining unit in NP. Right, there's a whole little group of workers that weren't organised by anybody. It took us 7 years. All right. Now, by the time we got our recognition certificate a few weeks ago, most of them are retired, some are dead, and we're not sure what we got left. And this is one of the things that happens. Now, what caused that delay? What caused that delay was that at every opportunity, lawyers poked their nose in. They challenged whether this person was a worker, whether that person was a worker. I mean, look what happened with the Bigwoo bargaining union at RBC. All right, 18 months worth of solid organizing work thrown away by some judge, all right, who probably never actually had to work anywhere, all right, and argue for overtime and where's the money coming from, all right, and just threw that away just like that, as if you could organize 1,800 workers, you know, in a hostile environment in an 8-week period. I mean, that's fantasy land, you know. Now, part of that, of course, is the legislation was not designed to be easy, which goes back to some of the things that we were talking about earlier, of course. So, and it's there almost as an obstacle race, right? But it also, it's one of the things that is beginning to happen is that there is an increasing legalization of the industrial relations process. Now, once upon a time, when you went to the industrial court, you'd see a union person on one side, and you may have seen the HR manager or personnel manager or whatever on the other side. Now the employer side is nearly always attorneys. Sad to say, you have unions who can't actually represent workers because they've lost the skills, right, employing attorneys. And then you've got these industrial relations hustlers, all right, who they don't care who they represent. You'll see them. I've seen judges in the industrial court, and there's somebody telling you, who are you representing today? You know, are you representing a union or are you representing an employer? Because last week he was wearing a different hat, you know. And then, of course, you've got employers, which are lawyers whose specific task is to undermine the process and challenge everything, because the employers they represent have got all the money in the world. They can go to the Court of Appeal, they can have judicial reviews. There ain't many unions that have got the money to throw at lawyers to do that, because, I mean, good lawyers like Douglas Mendes and some of the other people around, I mean, they do a lot out of the goodness of their heart. But, I mean, if you have to pay these people, boy, you're going to have a real problem. So even when it comes to, you know, the process itself, right, the 1%ers got a head start by a yard easily, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I think Dave, I hear.
We've left Alva even less to say.
I'm, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I hear the conversation on the 1%ers, and I appreciate that, but didn't get to that 1%er overnight. And until unless we understand the power that we hold, there will be no change. All right. If you remember when the 1% statement came out, an apology came on the back of it recognizing that we need the funds of the 99% in order to retain the 1%. And therefore, it's important for the union to build that level of sensitivity in the membership that you hold the power in terms of your dollar. So it's not just about us or we, the union, representing you. You must first represent yourself by the choices that you make. And I think that's what's happening now with the movement of Black Lives Matter, where they are literally telling big businesses that you want to discriminate, but you want our money. And we have to start the conversation there as well. Now, I heard a comment about coming late and so on. And therefore, we have to also build that level of consciousness in the worker. While you're protecting your rights, we also have to teach you about your responsibility to do what is right so that we can better protect your interests. Our interest is not in you becoming delinquent. Our interest is not in you being late and upsetting yourself and so on. Because at the end of the day, if there's no institution, there can be no union and there can be no job. So we have to be very holistic in our approach to building the capacity of the worker.
Mm-hmm. Alva?
Yes, Ian. My contribution now.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Let me make a few very quick points so that perhaps we can get into some more discussion.
Yeah, we have quite a few questions, I'm sure. So go ahead.
Really,
Yeah.
first of all, what has happened under COVID-19 and the lockdown and the so-called new normal, in my view, it's nothing new under the sun. They have been retrenching workers in thousands before COVID-19. The same Digicel that went and cut people pay at the start of the lockdown is the same Digicel that just recently sent home workers, 20% of the workforce. The same KFC ownership that cut people pay by 50% is the same owners, the very same owners who sent home 33 workers in Venco that belong to the whole group of companies. They have been restructuring and restructuring all the time. And their way of doing it is to cut pay and send home workers. Well, the point I want to make about that is that those solutions that they have put forward have never worked. They tried that in 1985 and 1986, and it didn't work. And the response of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, the 99%, was a one-day strike. It was called the Day of Resistance on the 6th of March, 1989, and followed up by the coup in 1990. And the government of the day today, they understand perfectly well that the measures that are being taken can very well lead to an uprising. So that is why Imbert was saying, well, I increase fuel price, and they right here. I do it once, I do it twice, and they know what to expect. So the more that they continue to treat working people that way, all that they are doing is advancing the inevitable. And I hope and pray that I am still alive to see it happen when it does. Second point, a system that is based on the exploitation of labor cannot help but to exploit labor, whether the system is owned and managed by black or white. So moving from one kind of capitalism to the next kind, it wouldn't change the price of coffee. Exploitation and oppression is intrinsic to the nature of capitalism, and you cannot inform capitalism. We have to put in place we have to put in place a different type of economic arrangement that would put people before profit. It would put health before wealth.
Mhm.
And it would allow the working people themselves a say in their own affairs, which we don't have. All we get to do is go and dip your finger in red ink, and we go and dip your finger in red ink again. I don't do that. I never did. But people will do it. And when they come out of the polling station, that's the end of their democracy. No more say nothing. That has to change. Look at what has been happening during the period of the lockdown. So many thousands lost their jobs. So many have complained that they cut their pay. In the union I had worked for, there was one employer in particular. One employer told the union, when the union requested information, where's the evidence to show that you're financially bad off? You know what the employer said to the union? That's none of your business. They have become more arrogant than anything else right now. And that is telling me that working people don't have a choice. Is either they put on the foot now, or else they will have to lie down and take. That's the only two things on the table. Either we stand up and fight against injustice now, or else we will eat the devil that the bread, eat the bread that the devil needs. Those are the options. And I don't think that it is without solutions. I believe that there are solutions, but people have to be able to get themselves organized. You see, just like how people in the United States, the masses organized themselves and they do what they had to do. And then it came to the Netherlands and they organized themselves and they do what they had. Even in Germany last night, I was watching it on TV. Thousands of Germans were out on the streets protesting too, right? Organize, organize, organize. So my contribution to this debate is that this is the period for us as trade unionists to agitate workers. Time to put on all the foot, take a stand. I mean, it is not that the enemy is that powerful that they can't be overcome and that we can't achieve this. I remember just the other day going through what Timothy Rudall had said back in 1937. Timothy Rudall, for those who don't know, was a member of the Legislative Council, and he had gone to Faizabad on the day of the strike in 1937 that Butler had called to tell the workers to go back out to work, to tell you don't get violent, or they can't match the machine guns and rifles that the soldiers and them have. And you know what he was saying? All you feel that the bottle, stone, and of all things, mango seed. Those were the weapons in 1937. All you feel that that could do something? Well, the reality was that it was the intervention of the people. Intervention of the people that brought about all the changes that we have. We got the right to vote. We got an increase in pay all over Trinidad and Tobago. We got the right to organize into unions, right? In addition to that, one of the most amazing things, I didn't realize it till late. We were able to get free education, free school meals, free books and uniforms for those who couldn't afford. Why? Butler had made the point that that is what poor British citizens are entitled to. Well, we are British citizens too. So treat us alike. And that was introduced. They argued for proper housing and shelter. Money was allocated for that eventually. I mean, so many things came out. We didn't have sick leave with pay. Carnage workers were demanding 2 weeks sick leave with pay. They didn't have that then, but we got it. And look at what we have now. We have sick leave extension with pay. So we were able to build, notwithstanding the little things that we had against a mighty enemy. And Trump boasting that they have the mightiest army in the world. And what did the soldiers do when they came to stop the protest? They had to take a knee. Why? Fundamental lesson. The power of the people is always greater than the people in power. And when workers begin to understand that, oh, I will then be able to smile in peace. So that's my contribution. The legislation and so on. I mean, everybody know there are quite a lot of defects in the legislation. We all know that. We have all tried over the last 30 odd years from government to get the legislations changed and nothing did. Well, it is time that we do, just like what we did to get the Retrenchment and Severance Benefits Act passed. There was a massive demonstration around the Queen's Park Savannah back in 1985. George Weeks and them was leading that. At that time, I was still young in the movement. And Darkashaw was in the front of the march. He came down and we marched around the Savannah and came down Frederick Street, right? And had a rally. And that when we brought out those people to march, that is how the act was eventually passed in the parliament, because people marched for protection against retrenchment and to ensure that their service didn't go down the drain. Unions had severance and so on in the collective agreements. The unorganized people didn't have that. So we had to stand up for them. And this is what we have to do now, because there's nobody else left to stand up for them. So we have to encourage them, join a union, and at the same time take this opportunity to tell unions, start to organize the unorganized. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Alva. But just before we take questions from the audience, I just want to try to tap back to the title of our discussion in looking at the legal framework and ask the question, is it enough to just leave it at organizing? You talked about Butler, and Butler spoke a very specific set of legislative agendas when he was rallying the masses in the 30s. What's our rallying objective now? When we march, what are we marching to achieve? When we organize in relation to the legislation, what are we marching to achieve in relation to legislative change?
Well, we could go back over all the submissions that were made by the trade unions. But those submissions that were made by the trade unions is not something that has been properly popularized on the ground. And that is the gap that exists between top and on the ground. Most of the workers in Trinidad and Tobago don't know the things that the trade union movement have submitted and have been calling for. So we need to educate people on those things. We have called for the shortening of the recognition process, right, under the Industrial Relations Act. That is one principal area that we are focused on. I mean, they didn't go and do a thorough job on the IRA. One had to pick out priorities to deal with. And they had also called for closing the gap on the Retrenchment and Severance Benefits Act, where people whose businesses are closed down and the workers are sent home, that they should be deemed to be retrenched. And the Jamaican legislation and other legislation in CARICOM, they provide for that. But we are lacking in that. So these are some of the things that we need to focus on as priorities. We can't have a tall shopping list of 100, but at least the main ones, like 2 that I've just spoken about, we should focus on that. If you ask on a personal note, I would say give us back our right to strike and engage in solidarity strike action.
And I think that's the concept, one of the concepts that I was listening for. The idea of actually having legislation built around rights rather than the legislation that seems to administer industrial relations. For instance, the only way you can cut the recognition process is if you focus on the rights of the workers to have the union represent them. And as someone said, there are times when all they have to do to establish their membership is raise their hand and have a head count.
Well, Ian, the Industrial Relations Act has achieved basically what it was designed to achieve, which was to stop strikes. When it was being passed, every Monday morning was a strike all over the place, and to get rid of solidarity strikes as well. I mean, the facts speak for themselves. Over the last 25 years, how many legal strikes have we had? Only the Oilfield Workers Trade Union has carried out that tradition. We might have had about 3 or 4 strikes legally, but handling disputes, everything is follow the procedure, the dispute procedure. Down the road in court we go, and that has been achieved by what the IRA had set out to do. The recognition issues, you know, a lot of strikes prior to the IRA that took place, and it was recorded in a thesis that Dave Smith had written. Right, Dave? A lot of the strikes that were recorded in that period before the Industrial Relations Act was based on recognition. Workers would go in and together with the unions and say, this is our union, recognize us. And if the employer don't agree, we go on strike. That's how recognition was settled. That is how recognition was settled. And a lot of the strikes were based on that single issue of recognition. But now we have this big, long process. And by the time you do get to the recognition board and they're doing checker records and so on, half your bargaining unit gone. You're fired.
All right.
In fact, just on the point that Alva made, one of the things that came out of the research that I did was that I looked at all the how long it took to get recognition from 1965 up to 1995. I looked at every single application, and what was interesting was that when there was a recession and there were fewer and fewer applications for recognition, it was taking longer and longer and longer. And there was an inverse relationship between how many applications there were and how long it took. And it went from the average of 6 months at the beginning to an average of 3 years when at its worst. And we know there are plenty of exceptions beyond that. I think Amoco was 20 years.
And you never got recognition from Amoco. Never.
Yeah.
Despite 20 years.
Yeah.
All right, let's turn to some of the questions that we have from the audience. Roger Pierre asked if the panel could comment on the low union participation percentage, which he believes lies at the cause of the powerlessness of the working class. The average white-collar worker doesn't identify with the trade union movement. Can you comment on that?
Well, I would like to weigh in on that simply because we talk about a white-collar worker, a worker nonetheless that will recognize only when time to go home or when he or she is negatively affected, that if they don't own, they're a worker. So what we have is a segmenting of the working class, the working people, and creating our own stratified system among ourselves. And that's the very mindset that we must address, is that you are a worker nonetheless because you're paid for your labor. Because when you don't participate in a struggle today, when your struggle comes, you will need participation. So that's what I'm saying. We need to build a level of class consciousness in the working people so that they will understand white collar, whatever color. Once you don't own, you're a worker, and you are likely to be affected in the same way. So you need to get involved in every worker issue.
I don't know that, when you look at the shape of the trade union movement in Trinidad and Tobago, it actually reflects what the question is suggesting. Because, obviously, traditionally, you would think of a trade unionist as being a manual worker in a factory, using their hands, being an engineer, getting dirty and things like that, not an office worker. But look at the growth areas that I've touched on with Big Roo. Look at tutor, all right? They're not manual workers, in the sense that you would traditionally understand it. Look at the public service with the PSA. Is probably, after Nuge, is probably the biggest union in the country, them and tutor. And so, and you only had to look at the newspapers last week. Who was it out making a fuss outside the hospitals? Nurses, mostly women too. All right. So I don't know that that the basis of the question really is entirely correct when you look around, because it does. But so that really reflects the fact that workers in those industries, which maybe in the 30s would never have dreamt of belonging to trade unions, if you go back to the 1930s, you know, or even maybe the 1940s and 50s. I mean, clearly societies have changed and workers have gone into their unions as they seem necessary. Now, of course, it doesn't mean there's not more work to be done, which is what we talked about earlier. But I think it's wrong to assume that, you know, white collar equals no union, you know. I think the challenges are small employers. Places like KFC, because the recognition process requires you to have more than 50% of workers in membership for 8 weeks. You look at something like KFC or Rituals or Subway. I mean, they've got so many outlets, and as soon as you think you've got it, people leave, you know, and it's going through your fingers. And so almost inevitably, those places which are low paid, need to be organized, all right, are at the sharp end of a lot of poverty and difficulties. They are difficult to organize because of the nature of the legislation and the nature of the industry itself and the legal requirement to get recognition.
Alva?
Yes. The comment that the individual had made, you know, it needs to be looked at against a factual background. It is not 100% true to say that the white collar worker has something against joining a union. If that were in fact so, then the union I had worked for more than 10 years would not exist. And that is the Banking, Insurance and General Workers Union. That union represents more white collar workers than any other category of workers. And when I say white collar, I don't only mean white in color, I also mean white collar. And,
all right.
and they are shop stewards and branch officers as well. Quite amazingly so, because Janice had raised the question of developing their class consciousness. Well, their participation in trade union activity developed their class consciousness and allowed them to participate in trade union activity. And in addition to the banking sector, the union represents workers in the other financial services sector, such as the insurance industry, central bank, and so on. Of all places, Central Bank, Trinidad and Tobago Security Exchange Commission, all those categories of workers, the union represents them. So I agree that there are some difficulties in organizing white collar workers, but to what extent it can really be stated as a serious problem, well, I think that that should be looked into a little more, because look at how the union was able to organize all those hundreds of workers in Royal Bank. Of all, hardest place to organize Royal Bank. And the organizers went from desk to desk, worker to worker, over 18 months to get hundreds of people to come in to join. And it's not to say that they don't want to join, they join willingly. So wherever there are white collar workers, the law says that they are workers and they have every right to join the union and to take part in all the activities of the union, including the leadership of the union.
Okay. Bisham Baldeo, if I'm not mistaken, this is one of our students at Cipriani. His question kind of reflects some of the angst that workers, especially unorganized workers, felt during the COVID lockdown. He says, during the lockdown, all trade union leaders went into quarantine, leaving behind the vulnerable workers. to fend for themselves. Workers have lost income and job security. Has the trade union movement disregard for our freedom of association? Is the trade union movement, is the leadership of the trade union movement bending over, I assume backwards, for the government? Has the trade union movement essentially abandoned workers?
May I? Let me lead off first.
Alva, what do you think?
I am not saying that the trade union movement has done enough. I am not saying that the trade union movement has done all that it should have done. But today I was getting a report from the branch president at one of the banks. And he told me that had it not been for the activities of the branch officers on the shop floor in the bank, the workers themselves would have been left defenseless. They had to confront the management with a list of proposals, put up screens between worker and customer in order to defend their health. And the management was reluctant, they eventually do it. And that wasn't all, you know. They wanted to cut pay in other places, and the union had to stop that too. So it is not that the unions were inactive. You have to appreciate that some unions, I mean, all the unions put together, you only represent a little less than 20%. Right? But quite a number of the unorganized youth workers who have suffered under COVID-19, under the actions of the employer, they have come to the union seeking representation. Right? Some people they get a pay cut, and after they get a pay cut, they get a retrench. And guess what? The severance pay was based on the
last salary.
Last salary. Oh, first the wicked. The wicked. But the unions have to deal with it.
Yeah.
The unions are there. So I am making an open call. Come and bring your complaint to the unions and let us deal with it. There are things that we can do. I mean, a pay cut is not just a breach of contract, you know. A pay cut is illegal industrial action taken against a worker under Section 63 of the Industrial Relations Act. You can't say that you're refusing to employ the worker under these terms that existed then and then imposing new terms on him. There are judgments that went completely against that, and employers will find. No, they won't find what we would like to see, that it should have been fined, because the law limits the penalty to $20,000. But at least there's some level of redress that can be done. So I am encouraging them, come and join the union, let the union take up on the case. It is not to say that we could have gone from one workplace to the next that is not unionized to ensure that workers are protected. Because I know in our union, well, the union I used to work in, right, all the labor relation officers were rostered to go and service the workers in their various branches. Everybody was out on patrol, visiting the branches, dealing with the problems as they arise, making sure that people have protective equipment and so on. Now, I can't speak for all the unions, so maybe Bisham must know some things I don't know. But certainly, the officers and shop stewards in that union, they rose to the occasion. And they ought to be complimented for that. But I am saying, I agree that that is not enough. The unions could have been much more vocal and much more upfront, taking the initiative all the time, because back in the 1980s, that is how we were. That is how I do it. We had the employers on the defensive. They can't say they couldn't pay. You're mad. That wasn't going to happen. They would get a fine ticket tomorrow morning, law or no law. That is how we said. But again, I accept part of the criticism that much more could have been done, much more should have been done. But it is never too late. Come and join the union, make your complaint heard.
Ms. Lorde?
You know, what I also want us to remember, which is why I think I probably focus on the the unitary approach the government as an employer took. You had essential workers out minus the union because it didn't deem the union to be essential. And therefore, the agility in response by the union was affected. So here you are only allowing certain persons to be out who were highly regulated at the early stages of the COVID lockdown. What I want to remind is that we are signatory to Geneva Conventions and ILO conventions, whether we ratify them or not. I think we are bound by the principles. And therefore, I am saying that the existence of COVID-19 was not sufficient for the workers' rights to be infringed the way it was, right, during that period. I do not think the employers met a burden sufficiently to prove that there were valid reasons for the actions that it took. To me, it looked as though it was an excuse to really oppress the workers.
Not excuse, it was deliberate.
I think it was an excuse. And while because the convention, especially Convention 158 that speaks about the termination of workers, it must be a last resort. You must look for alternative solutions. All right? And we talk about unionized workers, yes, but this applies also to the non-unionized worker. Termination has to, and it mandates governments and member states to have safeguards in place so that workers would not be exposed. And I can't stress enough how much we have failed as governments. And I want to stress governments because it's not just one government. And the reality is, I think, once we could deal with campaign financing and what we know as politics, we will be able to bring some change. It's time for the labor movement to start to mobilize so that we can get the change that is necessary for the working class to enjoy some level of benefits from their labor, right? I think on the heel of that as well, especially non-unionized workers, some of decisions taken to create a glut in the labor market. So you have persons afraid to lose their jobs because they can be supplanted, they can be replaced by immigrants. It's another issue for the trade union movement to address. The fact that we have a definition for essential services and that can be broadened at the drop of a hat without consultation with the trade union movement is an area of breach that needs to be addressed. So we really have to take a multi-pronged approach to dealing with industrial relations climate in Trinidad and Tobago because we really don't want it to go back to the watershed period of the 1950s.
There was a very important point that Alva made, which we mustn't bypass, I think. And that is the example he gave was that it was the local branch that responded to the employer. And the fact is, what makes a union strong is how well organized it is in the workplace. It doesn't matter whether the president is good at bumping their gums or not, or whether they're good, bad, or indifferent. The strength of the union is at the workplace. And the example that Alva gave showed you that that particular union branch had got its act together.
Yes.
Right? And I know from experience that Bigwoo has taken a particular organizational approach of building the union at the workplace. And those unions that don't do that don't have a branch structure and rely on head office to service them rather than doing the work themselves, because that's what gives you the strength.
Okay. Looking at another of the questions submitted, do you think sectoral bargaining or co-determination could be a viable alternative for Trinidad and Tobago in light of the mobilization challenges faced by unions? This came from Darren Dookie, one of our past students as well. Panel?
Am I all first?
Well, so what the question was about union
bargaining
elections.
Sectoral bargaining.
So,
sectoral bargaining.
do you think that sectoral bargaining or co-determination could be a viable alternative for Trinidad and Tobago in light of the mobilization challenges faced by unions?
I thought you said electoral, not sectoral.
I think,
Okay,
sorry.
go ahead, Janice.
Let me take Ms. Lorde first. Can I take Ms. Lorde first, Mr. Allen? You've been speaking
I think it could, and I think it should, because to me, the agenda for subdividing the bigger unions into smaller unions was to achieve just what is happening now. So we need to, and that's what I was saying earlier, the unions need to collaborate. So sectorial bargaining would mean the unions coming together to engage in bargaining. Right? Because if you look at, particularly, let's look at the public services, right? Like fire and prison. They came out from PSA. So by placing them in their own unit, you reduce the strength of the PSA, which emerged from OWTU. So we see the strategy and we see the system set in place to break the strength of collective bargaining. And therefore, what we have to do now is to reverse it by our approach and our strategies to engage in sectorial bargaining.
Alva?
Well, I understand what the concept is as practiced in Europe and elsewhere. But in our own reality, to some extent, there is sectorial bargaining. Because when one union is bargaining with, let us say, as I would have recently experienced it, when one union is bargaining with a bank, right? The outcome of that negotiations is purely automatic on negotiations with all the other banks. Because what it do is take a market-based approach to salaries and wages. That has been the trend for a few years well now. Similarly, in the top sector of the energy sector, right? Oil and electricity rates, right, tend to go hand in hand. Whatever is the outcome in oil would impact upon the outcome in electricity and so on. So Tutor, for example, has been talking about using the market-based approach to determining salaries and wages, and they have been doing that for about more than 10 years. Since the days of the last days, I should say, of Trevor Oliver, right? It's 20 years, yes, 20 years now. And the Estate Police Association, they also, not just the Estate Police Association, but also the police, they also bargain based on what happens in the entire sector, and they use the average market rates, right? Now, it's just that in some cases, you'll have a claim for the top level of the market rates. Similarly, in the manufacturing sector, the top manufacturing sector, especially the East-West corridor, right? When Carib goes to bargain with the employer, the union goes to bargain with the employer at Carib, what do you think they're asking for? The rates at Lever Brothers and at Nestles. So in that sense, there is some aspect of sectoral bargaining. But the truth of the matter is that if you look to apply it at the level of the European model for sectoral bargaining, you're going to run into some serious difficulties, especially in these economic times now, where none of the employers are seeking to bargain.
Yeah.
So whether you want to go with sectoral bargaining to solve your problem, it ain't gonna carry nowhere. The lecturers in the college, well, let me not say that.
Thank you. Dave?
Well, I was going to say that whether that would be possible within our legal framework, I think is questionable anyway. But there are some practical things that could be done, have been tried, but unions have never stuck to it. Firstly, it doesn't help that we've got three trade union federations. I mean, I'm not sure that one of them is actually any more than a letterhead. But I mean, we should have one trade union centre to start off with. But also, if you look at places like Neil and Massey and Ansa Macau, where they are big employers, big conglomerates, there's lots of different unions organising in there. I mean, Neil and Massey, for instance, I know there's MASA, TWU, Big Woo, OWTU, NUGFW. Well, I mean, I can about 5 or 6. Was that Alva?
Contractors and General Workers Union.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've just run 6 unions off the top of our head. Now, you try and do negotiations there and say, I want to improve the medical plan or I want to improve the pension plan, then you're not going to be able to do that because that is a group plan and you know, you can do what you want in the bargaining unit and in negotiations. Now, that's where there needs to be an across-the-board Neil and Massey joint union committee and an Ansa Macau joint union committee so that you can mobilize around that because you know what their profits are on a group level, all right? They won't easily give you what it is on a company-by-company level. So then that is where, on a practical sense, without having trying to restructure, you know, the approach to collective bargaining, which is maybe what comes out of the question. I mean, that is real practical stuff that ought to be happening and could be happening if only unions would get their act together in the simplest of ways, you know.
Well, Roger Pierre asked a second question that kind of goes right down that alley. He asked if trade unions actually need to employ professional management. You know? People who are actually trained to manage organizations, actually trained to market organizations. Is the day of the trade unionists rising from the ranks to lead something that needs to be in the rearview mirror?
Well, I think all 3 of us here have come up through the ranks, Ian. I was the shop steward and the union branch secretary before I was a union official. So, and the reality is, you see, that is what gives you your understanding of the movement and what happens at the shop floor because you've experienced it, you know. And you can't, to be honest with you, no matter what Cipriani does, you can't learn trade unionism or industrial relations in a classroom. Right? You learn it in the shop floor. Right, and that's the truth to
it. Just one point. I am not saying that there is no need and no role for professionals. Right? You might have to hire a professional accountant, as some do. Right? You might have to hire a professional research person, as some do. But on the other hand, what you don't want developing in the union is that the very same things that you fight the employer for or fight the employer against, you have to come and fight that in your own union too because of those concepts that the professionals tend to bring to them. The professionals that are taken on board have a pro-union outlook. Not that there's no need for them. Of course there is. But at the same time, the outlook is what is going to additionally come because that is going to determine how they carry out their different functions.
Okay. And let's give the last word to
if you're a professional, but if you're a professional industrial relations person, you can flip-flop from one side to the other because you don't have a class position.
Yeah.
Well, that is why I said.
Yeah, I know.
They must have that class outlook.
Absolutely.
Ms. Lord, can I give you the last word?
I want us to recognize that the fight is real for us and it will take leadership, strong leadership to bring about change. Yes, there are gaps in our legislation and we need legislative reform. But I also want to look at what exists and be in breach with impunity and go after that which already exists. And that is to say, lobby for strong sanctions against those persons who have breached what already exists while we are strategizing for change going forward. All right, the COVID is not unique to us alone, so we know there's worldwide impact, and we have different, several territories facing similar situations. And therefore, we need to really collaborate with other regions or within the region to craft the way forward as best, not only for our economy, but for the region's economy as a whole. All right? We need to mobilize. We need to sensitize the working population as to the importance of belonging to a trade union. We also need to drive home the point of the trade union movement that we need to build capacity to represent properly. I don't believe in bringing in professionals. I believe from within your own class consciousness, because while you can teach competencies, you can't teach attitudes. All right, so I agree with Dave and Alva in terms of a professional who have that class consciousness, we do have that type of solidarity. Bringing them in to tell us what to manage our trade union movement, to me that does not really make sense. I would like to see the working people be given their just due, because without labor, there can be no profits. And we must make sure capitalists understand that without labor, there is no profit. And therefore, if there's profit, labor must benefit.
Thank you, Ms. Lorde. Let me say thank you to the panelists for being here and sharing so well this evening. Thank you for the people who have been viewing our discussion and attending this impromptu Labor Studies Department meeting. I hope Dave, Alva, Janice, that we get the opportunity soon to sit in the cafeteria and drink coffee over these discussions, once again. And I think that we need to do follow up past this discussion. The topic is way too large. We have only covered the tip of the iceberg. We need to have more discussions along these lines, and maybe we can start inviting some other people to join us in our department meeting in the future. Thank you very much. I'd like to invite the audience to this Friday's next webinar. It's at 5 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. and it's entitled Two Sides of the Same Coin, Trade Unions and Credit Unions. This webinar will focus on the role of credit unions in impacting working people and consequently the trade union movement as well. So that's it for us. Department, once again, thank you, and thank all of you for viewing this evening. Good night.
Yes.